Now that Frank is dead, stop acting like this house still belongs to you.
My daughter-in-law whispered across the funeral dinner table.
Pack your things before Sunday.
My son, Cole, didn't say a word. He just stared down at his plate and slowly nodded. I felt something inside me go cold. Not broken, not shattered, cold. I left the table without arguing, without crying, without begging for dignity from people who had already decided I no longer deserved any. The next morning, I drove to the bank. Frank had used for over 30 years, and what I found there changed everything. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. Some nights, it helps to know grief has witnesses. The dining room still smelled faintly like rosemary, and baked ham from the meal no one had truly eaten. Our old farmhouse outside Cedar Ridge had always felt warm after family gatherings. Frank used to fill every corner of the room with his laugh, the kind that made people loosen their shoulders and stay longer than they planned. But that night, the house felt hollow, too quiet, too large. The rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows, while the grandfather clock in the hallway counted each second with painful precision. Tick, 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 tick. 3 days earlier, I had buried my husband of 46 years. 46 years of marriage reduced to sympathy, casseroles stacked in aluminum, trays and guests spring condolences near the coat rack. At 71 years old, I thought I understood loss. My friends had lost husbands. My sister lost hers nearly a decade ago. You tell yourself you're prepared for the day eventually coming. You never are, especially not when the grief is followed so quickly by cruelty. Mallory Rowan sat across from me at the table, delicately folding her napkin, like she was finishing dinner at a country club, instead of discussing where her widowed mother-in-law would sleep next. Weak, she wore black perfectly. Elegant black dress, diamond earrings, cold eyes. Judith, she said carefully, in that soft voice she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable. This house is simply too much for one person now. I kept my eyes on my coffee cup.
The steam had already faded.
I've managed this house since before you were born, I answered quietly. Mallory gave a thin smile. Yes, but Frank handled the finances, taxes, repairs, insurance. She tilted her head slightly. You shouldn't have to stress yourself at your age. At your age. Funny how those 4 words suddenly appear the moment a widow becomes inconvenient. I looked toward Cole, waiting for him to interrupt her. Waiting for my son to remember who taught him how to tie his shoes, who sat awake through his fevers, who worked double shifts at the diner after Frank's 3 hours were cut back in the 80s. But Cole just rubbed his jaw and avoided my eyes. The market's good right now, he muttered. Selling the place would make sense. Selling the place. My stomach tightened. Frank and I built this home room by room over 30 years. The porch railings were carved by his hands. The kitchen cabinets still carried tiny scratches from when Cole used toy trucks like battering rams as a little boy. Every wall held a memory, and suddenly they were discussing it, like a piece of unwanted furniture. I'm not selling, I said firmly. Mallory sighed dramatically and leaned back in her chair. That's exactly the kind of stubbornness we're worried about, As though they'd formed some quiet little alliance, whilst I was sitting beside Frank's hospital bed, holding his hand during those final hours. The anger inside me flickered for the first time then. Small, sharp, dangerous. Still, I stayed calm. Frank always used to say anger was expensive. Never spend it too early, Judy girl. So I folded my hands in my lap and listened. We've already spoken with a realtor, Mallory continued. And honestly, a retirement community might be healthier for you socially. Retirement community. There it was. The real conversation. Not concern. Removal. I looked at Cole again. Did you know about this? Silence. Then finally he nodded once, slowly. like a man agreeing to cancel cable service instead of uprooting his grieving mother from her home. It's just practical, Mom. Practical. I almost laughed. Grief apparently becomes an inconvenience very quickly for people eager to inherit your square footage. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. The lights flickered briefly above us. Mallory crossed her arms. Frank's gone, Judith. Things change. Her voice sharpened slightly then, enough for the mask to slip. You can't keep pretending this house is still yours. Still yours. I stared at her. And in that moment, I finally understood something that had been growing quietly for years. Mallory had never considered me family. I was simply the final obstacle standing between her and the life she wanted. A larger house, more land, more control. And my son, my sweet little Cole who used to run into my arms after Little League games. He had chosen his side long ago. I just hadn't wanted to see it. I think you should start packing this weekend, Mallory said softly. Before things become unpleasant, the cruelty of that sentence settled over the table like frost. Cole didn't stop her, didn't defend me, didn't even look ashamed. So I stood slowly, carried my untouched coffee cup to the sink, and rinsed it carefully beneath warm water. No trembling hands, no tears, just silence. Because deep down, beneath the grief and humiliation, another feeling had begun taking shape. Frank had never trusted people easily, and 2 months before he died, he had made a strange request. "Promise me," he'd whispered from his hospital bed, "if anything ever feels wrong after I'm gone, go see Stanley Pierce at First National Bank." At the time, I thought grief and medication were clouding his thoughts. The next morning, I drove there alone. The drive to First National Bank took 23 minutes. I counted every one of them. The windshield wipers pushed rainwater back and forth across the glass, while the hills outside Cedar Ridge blurred into gray shadows. Frank used to love this road in autumn, when the maple trees turned deep red and gold. He'd drive with one hand on the wheel, and the other resting lightly over mine. That morning, both seats beside me felt unbearably empty. I kept replaying the dinner conversation in my head. Mallory's polished smile. Cole refusing to look at me. The word practical repeating itself over and over until it sounded crueler than shouting ever could. But by the time I pulled into the bank parking lot, my chest felt tight with exhaustion. First National wasn't fancy. It sat on the corner of Main Street, beside an old hardware store that still sold fishing bait and tractor parts. Frank trusted places like that. Places where people still remembered your name. When I stepped inside, the warmth hit me first. Warm air, muted carpet, the faint smell of coffee drifting from somewhere behind the customer desks. A young teller looked up and smiled politely. "Good morning, Mom." I nodded carefully and removed my damp gloves. "I'm here to see Stanley Pierce." The girl's expression changed immediately. Recognition. "Oh, Mr. Pierce is expecting me." The words settled strangely in my stomach. She disappeared through a wooden door near the back offices, and a moment later Stanley himself emerged. He looked older than I remembered. Thinner, silver-haired now, with heavy reading glasses hanging low on his nose. But his eyes were still sharp and steady, the same eyes that had helped Frank navigate every mortgage payment and business loan for decades. "Judith," he said softly. "Not Mrs. Rowan. Judith." His voice carried sympathy that felt genuine enough to nearly crack the fragile control I'd been holding on to since the funeral. "I'm sorry about Frank." I nodded once because speaking suddenly seemed dangerous. Stanley guided me into his office and quietly closed the door behind us. The room looked exactly the same as it had 15 years ago. Dark oak shelves lined with binders. Framed photographs of Stanley holding oversized fish beside Lake Benton. A tiny brass clock ticking near the filing cabinet. Safe, steady, unchanged. I sat carefully in the leather chair across from his desk while rain tapped softly against the office windows. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Stanley folded his hands together. Frank came to see me 3 months ago, he said. 3 months. That was shortly after the doctors told us the treatments weren't working anymore. I felt my throat tighten. He seemed worried, Stanley continued carefully. Not about his health, about you. A strange ache spread through my chest then. Even dying, Frank had still been trying to protect me. I looked down at my wedding ring. 46 years together, and I still reached instinctively for his hand whenever life frightened me. What did he say? I asked quietly. Stanley hesitated. He asked me to prepare certain documents, and he gave very specific instructions about when you should receive them. My pulse quickened slightly. Outside the office, I could hear muffled phones ringing and printers humming ordinary sounds. Meanwhile, my entire life suddenly felt like it was balancing on the edge of something enormous. Stanley opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a thick manila envelope. My name was written across the front in Frank's handwriting, Judith Rowan. Just seeing those familiar uneven letters nearly destroyed me. Frank's hands had always shaken slightly after the factory accident back in 1994. Even his handwriting carried traces of it. I reached for the envelope slowly. He told me not to give this to anyone else, Stanley said quietly. No matter what happened. Anyone else. A memory flashed through my mind then. 2 weeks earlier, while Frank slept upstairs under heavy medication, Mallory had wandered into his home office pretending to search for a phone charger. At the time, it felt harmless. Now it didn't. I slid one finger beneath the seal and carefully opened the envelope. Inside were copies of property records, bank statements, legal documents, and one handwritten letter folded neatly on top. My vision blurred before I even opened it. Judith, if you're reading this, then I was right to worry. The room seemed to go silent around me. Frank knew. Somehow, before he died, Frank had known something was wrong inside our family. My hands trembled as I continued reading. I love our son. I always will. But love can make people weak. And weakness can be dangerous. When someone ambitious is whispering in your ear. Mallory. He meant Mallory. A cold sensation crawled slowly down my spine. Frank had seen it, too. The manipulation. The distance growing between Cole and me. The subtle ways Mallory always redirected conversations about money, property, inheritance. I swallowed hard and kept reading. There are things about this house and my accounts that Cole does not know. Legally, everything was protected, long before I got sick. I blinked. Protected? Stanley watched me carefully from across the desk, but didn't interrupt. I turned the page. Under no circumstances are you to leave that house because of pressure, guilt, or intimidation. The property belongs to you completely, Judith, not partially. Completely. I stared at the words. My house, not Cole's, not shared, mine. Suddenly Mallory's voice from dinner echoed in my head again. You can't keep pretending this house is still yours. A sharp, almost bitter laugh rose in my throat. Pretending. The entire time, they had been the ones pretending. Stanley leaned forward slightly. There's more, he said carefully. Then he opened another folder, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. Stanley slid the second folder across the desk slowly, almost carefully, like he already knew the weight of what sat inside it. I looked down at the documents. Transfer requests, loan applications, property inquiry forms. Every page carried either Cole's signature or Mallory's handwriting. A strange numbness spread through my arms as I turned the first sheet over. 3 months ago. That was the date printed across the top. 3 months ago, Frank had still been alive, weak, dying, sleeping most afternoons in the rickside the living recliner beeves up the living room window while I covered him with blankets and adjusted his medication every 4 hours. And somehow, during all of that, my son and his wife had already begun preparing paperwork connected to our home. I looked up slowly. What is this? Stanley exhaled heavily through his nose. Cole came to the bank twice after Frank's diagnosis became terminal. The word terminal still hit me like a blade. Even now, even after the funeral, some grief never softened. He requested information regarding property succession. Stanley continued carefully. At first, I assumed Frank had sent him. But Frank didn't. No. The office suddenly felt colder. I lowered my eyes back to the papers. One document had yellow sticky notes attached to the corners. Mallory's handwriting curved sharply across the page. Estimate resale value after transfer. Check tax implications if Judith relocates. Relocates. Not if Judith agrees. Not if Judith wants. Just relocates. As though I were furniture to be moved into storage after Frank died. My stomach twisted painfully. Stanley removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Judith, there's something else you need to understand.
Silently.
Frank came. Fimes suspicious after Mallory started pressuring Cole about the property last winter. That explained the arguments. Tiny moments I had tried so hard to ignore. Mallory suddenly asking detailed questions about mortgage balances during Christmas dinner. Cole insisting we should simplify things by adding his name to utility accounts. The uncomfortable silence whenever I entered a room unexpectedly. At the time, I told myself grief was making me paranoid. Now every memory returned sharper than broken glass. Stanley opened another file. Inside were copies of emails, printed bank communications, notes from meetings. Frank asked me to document everything, he said quietly. Everything. My eyes moved across the pages slowly. One email from Mallory caught my attention immediately. Once the house is legally under Cole's control, convincing Judith to downsize shouldn't be difficult. I stopped breathing for a second. Not if. Once. The certainty in those words terrified me more than anger would have. This had not been emotional, not impulsive, planned, careful, quiet. A sickness settled deep inside my chest. I thought about the last Easter dinner we spent together before Frank became bedridden. Mallory smiling while serving pie. Cole laughing at one of Frank's old stories. Everyone appearing normal. Meanwhile, they were already discussing where I would go after my husband died. How long had they been waiting? The thought made me physically ill. I'm sorry, Stanley said softly. I shook my head slowly. No, I whispered. I think part of me already knew. That was the truth that hurt most, not the betrayal itself. But realizing my instincts had been warning me for years while I kept silencing them to preserve peace inside the family. Women my age are taught to smooth things over. Don't make scenes. Don't accuse people. Keep the family together, even if it destroys you quietly. Stanley leaned back in his chair. Frank didn't trust Mallory. The bluntness of the sentence startled me. Frank rarely spoke harshly about anyone, especially family. But suddenly, memories resurfaced with painful clarity. Frank watching Mallory too carefully during dinners. His silence whenever she talked about expensive renovations. The way he once told me, very quietly in bed one night, Cole confuses admiration with love. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now I did. Mallory admired security, control, status, and my son had mistaken that hunger for devotion. I stared out the office window at the rain sliding down the glass. Cedar Ridge looked small and gray beneath the storm clouds. A quiet town, the kind where people still waved from pickup trucks and left pies on neighbors' porches after funerals. But betrayal happened in places like this too. Maybe worse, because nobody expected it. Stanley carefully folded his hands again. There's one final thing Frank instructed me to tell you if you ever came here alone. A chill moved through me. Alone. Frank knew I would eventually walk into this office abandoned. What was it? Stanley looked directly at me. He said, if Cole ever tried to force you out of that house, you were to stop protecting him. The words landed heavily between us. For years, I had protected my son from consequences, from criticism, from hard truths. Even after he married Mallory and slowly drifted away from me, I still made excuses for him. He's stressed. He's busy. Marriage changes people. But sitting there in Stanley's office, surrounded by proof that my own child had quietly prepared for my removal before Frank was even buried, something inside me finally cracked open. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to let reality in. Stanley slid a small brass key across the desk. I stared at it. Frank rented a private safe deposit box 6 months ago, he said. He wanted only you to access it. The key felt cold against my palm. What's inside? Stanley hesitated. I don't fully know. That answer somehow frightened me more, because Frank was not a dramatic man. He was practical, careful, deliberate. If he had hidden something before his death, then he must have believed our family was already in danger long before I understood it myself. I closed my fingers tightly around the key. Outside, thunder rolled again across Cedar Ridge, and for the first time since Frank's funeral, my grief began slowly changing into something else. Something sharper. Something awake. I drove home from the bank with Frank's brass key, hidden deep inside my coat pocket. The rain had stopped by then, but the roads through Cedar Ridge still shimmered dark beneath the cloudy afternoon sky. Water dripped from telephone wires. Puddles gathered beside cracked sidewalks downtown. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. That felt almost insulting. How could the world remain so ordinary when mine had quietly fallen apart? I stopped at a red light near Miller's grocery and suddenly remembered bringing Cole there when he was 7 years old. He used to sit in the shopping cart, wearing that little red winter hat Frank loved. Every Saturday, he'd beg for chocolate milk and comic books, while I tried to stretch $40 across an entire week of groceries. Back then, loving my son felt simple, natural, safe. I tightened my hands around the steering wheel. Somewhere along the way, I had lost the ability to see him clearly. By the time I pulled into the driveway, dusk had already started settling over the property. The old farmhouse stood quietly beneath the oak trees, its white paint glowing pale gray beneath the evening sky. Home, or at least it used to feel that way. Mallory's SUV sat parked near the garage. Of course, I remained inside my car for a long moment, watching the kitchen window. As shadows moved inside, 2 figures, Cole and Mallory, talking, planning. The realization no longer felt dramatic now, just factual. That was the worst part about betrayal. After a certain age, it didn't arrive like explosions in movies. It arrived softly, in whispers, in paperwork, in conversations held while you were upstairs, helping your dying husband breathe comfortably through the night. I finally stepped out of the car and walked toward the house slowly. The moment I opened the front door, I heard voices from the dining room. She doesn't even know how expensive this place is to maintain, Mallory was saying. I froze quietly in the hallway. She'll fight it emotionally, she continued. That's what older people do when they're scared. Older people. Not Judith. Not your mother. Just older people. Cole sighed heavily. We should wait a little longer. A pause followed. Then Mallory laughed softly. And let Stanley Pierce convince her otherwise? Absolutely not. My pulse slowed, not sped up, slowed. Because suddenly every piece connected together perfectly. They knew about Stanley, which meant they had already been trying to control information before Frank even died. I stepped into the dining room, deliberately enough for my shoes to make noise against the hardwood floor. Both of them looked up immediately. Mallory recovered first. She always did. There you are, she said brightly. We were getting worried. Worried. Such a polished little lie. I stopped for groceries, I answered calmly. Cole glanced toward the counter. You didn't bring any groceries. For a second, nobody spoke. Then I gave a small shrug and removed my coat. I changed my mind. The tension in the room felt immediate, tiny, sharp. Mallory studied my face carefully, probably searching for signs that I knew something. I gave her nothing. Frank used to say silence. Unsettled, dishonest people, more than anger ever could. So I stayed quiet. Mallory stood and walked toward the stove. "Made soup," she said sweetly. "You should eat something." The performance almost impressed me now that I could finally see it clearly. Every gesture carefully curated. Every expression rehearsed. Even her kindness felt strategic. I sat slowly at the table while Cole rubbed his palms together nervously. "Mom," he started. "About the conversation last night." "I'm tired," I interrupted softly. His mouth closed immediately. "Good." For once, I wanted them uncomfortable. Mallory placed a bowl in front of me and smiled tightly. "You know, we're only trying to help." I looked up at her, then really looked at her. Perfect makeup despite the long day. Cream sweater without a wrinkle. Wedding ring sparkling beneath the kitchen light. A woman who had spent years studying weakness in other people while carefully hiding her own ambition behind manners. "You seem very invested in my future, Mallory," I said quietly. Something flickered behind her eyes, only for a second. Then it disappeared. "Well, your family. Family." Family? Interesting word coming from someone who had already planning my relocation and Bishation before Frank's funeral flowers had wilted. I lowered my gaze back to the soup. "I visited the bank today." The silence that followed was immediate. Cole looked up sharply. Mallory's hand stopped moving. There it was, fear, tiny, controlled, but real. "What for?" Cole asked carefully. I lifted the spoon calmly. "Frank handled most financial things. I realized there are details I should probably understand now." Neither of them moved. Neither of them blinked. And suddenly, I understood something else. They didn't know what Frank had protected, which meant whatever he left behind still frightened them. Good. For the first time in days, I felt something close to stability returning beneath my feet. Not safety, not peace, just clarity. Mallory forced another smile. "That sounds responsible. Responsible." Another polished word. I almost admired how easily cruelty disguised itself as concern in people like her. That night, after they went upstairs, I stayed alone in the kitchen long after midnight. The farmhouse creaked softly around me, while wind brushed against the porch screens outside. Frank's coffee mug still sat beside the sink. His reading glasses remained folded near the newspaper basket. Tiny pieces of ordinary life untouched by death. Or betrayal. I reached into my coat pocket slowly and removed the brass key Stanley had given me earlier. Small, heavy, important. I turned it carefully between my fingers while Frank's final words echoed inside my mind. "If Cole ever tries to force you out, stop protecting him." Upstairs, I heard footsteps moving across the floorboards above me. Cole and Mallory, my family. Or at least the people pretending to be. I closed my hand tightly around the key. Then I made a decision. Tomorrow morning, I would open Frank's safe deposit box, and whatever truth waited inside, I was finally ready to face it. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, lying there beneath the heavy quilt. Frank and I bought during our anniversary trip to Vermont. Years ago, I forgot everything. Then reality returned all at once. Frank was gone. My son wanted my house. And somewhere inside First National Bank sat a safe deposit box my husband had hidden from everyone except me. I stared at the ceiling while pale gray light slowly crept across the bedroom walls. The silence felt unbearable. For 46 years, mornings had belonged to Frank. The sound of the shower running before dawn. The smell of coffee drifting down the hallway. His terrible humming while reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Now there was nothing. Just absence. I sat up slowly, my joints aching from another sleepless night. The digital clock beside the bed read 5:12 a.m. Downstairs, the house remained quiet. Cole and Mallory were still asleep. Good. I didn't want questions. I dressed carefully in dark slacks and a cream sweater, brushed my silver hair into place, and applied lipstick for the first time since the funeral. Not because anyone would notice, because I needed to remember who I was before grief turned me invisible. When I stepped into the kitchen, the farmhouse still carried traces of yesterday's tension. Mallory's expensive lavender hand soap sat beside my old ceramic sink. Her protein shake powder cluttered the counter where Frank used to keep peaches from our garden. Little invasions, tiny replacements happening so gradually I almost hadn't noticed them before. Almost. I brewed coffee quietly and stood at the window while the machine sputtered and hissed. Outside, fog rolled low across the fields behind the house. Frank loved mornings like this. "World feels honest before people wake up," he used to say. My throat tightened painfully. I missed him so much it physically hurt. Not just the man himself, the safety of him, the certainty, the way he could walk into a room and somehow make life feel manageable again. Without him, everything felt exposed, fragile. At 6:03, footsteps sounded upstairs. A moment later, Cole entered the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. For a brief second, seeing him standing there in old sweatpants and messy hair reminded me of the little boy who used to climb into my bed after thunderstorms. Then the memory vanished. Because little boys do not secretly prepare paperwork to remove their widowed mothers from their homes. "Morning," he muttered. "Morning." He opened the refrigerator and frowned slightly. "You're up early. I have errands." That caught his attention immediately. "What kind of errands?" I poured coffee calmly into my favorite blue mug. "Bank, grocery store, maybe the pharmacy." His shoulders stiffened slightly at the word bank. Tiny reaction, but I noticed now. I noticed everything now. Mallory entered the kitchen moments later wrapped in a silk robe the color of champagne. Perfectly polished, even half awake. "Judith," she said with surprise. "You should have woken me. I could have made breakfast." Such careful performance. As though kindness could erase what I'd overheard yesterday. "I managed breakfast alone for most of my adult life," I answered softly. An awkward silence followed. Cole focused on the refrigerator. Mallory smiled too brightly. Interesting how uncomfortable honesty made them. I gathered my purse and keys slowly. "I may be gone a while." Mallory crossed her arms lightly. "Need company?" "No." The answer came faster than I intended. Something cold flashed briefly across her face before the polite mask returned. "Well," she said carefully, "don't overdo things. Stress isn't good at your age." There it was again. At your age. People say those words when they want to reduce you into something smaller. Fragile. Manageable. Dismissible. I gave a small nod and walked out before either of them could continue. The drive back to First National felt different this time. Yesterday, I arrived grieving. Today, I arrived awake. Stanley greeted me quietly and led me downstairs beneath the main bank offices to the vault area. The hallway smelled faintly of metal and old paper. Heavy steel doors lined the walls like silent secrets. Stanley stopped beside a private viewing room and handed me a small envelope. "Frank left one more instruction," he said carefully. I stared at him. "He told me not to stay with you while you opened the box." A chill moved through me. "Why?" Stanley hesitated. "He said you'd need privacy when you learned the truth." The truth. Not paperwork, not finances. Truth. My heartbeat slowed strangely as he unlocked the vault compartment and stepped away. Inside sat a single black lockbox. Simple. Unremarkable. I slid it carefully onto the table inside the viewing room and inserted the brass key Frank left me. For a moment, I just stared at it. 46 years of marriage. And somehow my husband had still carried fears. He never fully spoke aloud. My fingers trembled as the lock finally clicked open. Inside were photographs, documents, a sealed letter, and beneath them, a digital recorder. Confusion spread through me slowly. I picked up the recorder first. A small piece of masking tape had been attached to the side in Frank's handwriting. If anything happens to me sooner than expected, listen carefully. My blood ran cold. Sooner than expected. Not if I die, if something happens. Suddenly the room felt too small, too quiet. I pressed play. Static crackled softly through the speaker. Then Frank's voice filled the room, weak, tired, but unmistakably Frank. "Judy girl," he whispered, "if you're hearing this, then I was right not to trust them." Frank's voice trembled slightly through the tiny recorder speaker. But beneath the weakness, I heard something else. Fear. Real fear. "Judy girl," he said again softly, followed by a long cough. "I need you to listen carefully and not interrupt me like you always do." Despite everything, my eyes filled instantly. That was Frank, even exhausted and frightened. He still sounded like the man who teased me while fixing porch railings on Sunday afternoons. I pressed the recorder tighter against my ear. "If you're hearing this," he continued, "then either I died before I could explain things, or certain people moved faster than I expected." My stomach tightened painfully. Certain people, not strangers, family. There was rustling in the background, then another cough. "I didn't want to believe it at first," Frank whispered. God knows I tried not to. "Cole's my son." The word son nearly broke him. I closed my eyes. Even now, hearing Frank struggle with that reality hurt more than my own betrayal. Because Frank had loved Cole with his whole heart. Baseball games, fishing trips, helping him buy his first truck, teaching him how to build shelves in the garage. Frank spent his entire life believing loyalty could be taught through love. But love doesn't always survive ambition. "I started noticing changes last year," he continued weakly. "Mostly after Mallory lost that real estate deal in Benton County."
My eyebrows pulled together slightly. I remembered that.
Mallory had been furious for weeks after some luxury development project collapsed. She smiled through it publicly, but at home, she became colder. Sharper. At the time, I thought it was stress. Now I wondered how much money she had already expected to gain from our property. Frank exhaled heavily into the recorder. She started asking strange questions after that. About the house, about my insurance policies, about whether your name was still on certain accounts. A chill spread slowly across my arms. Insurance policies, not memories, not grief, money, property, assets. I stared down at the photographs scattered across the table beside the recorder. One picture showed Mallory standing beside our back porch, talking to a man in a gray suit. A realtor. The timestamp printed in the corner made my stomach drop. The photo had been taken 2 weeks before Frank died. 2 weeks. While I was upstairs organizing medication schedules and sleeping in hospital chairs beside my husband. They were already discussing the house. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep listening. "I hired a private investigator after Easter," Frank admitted quietly. That shocked me so deeply, I nearly stopped the recording. Frank hated drama, hated suspicion. For him, to hire someone meant he had been truly frightened. "There are copies of everything in the folder," he said. "Emails, meetings, financial records." My hands trembled as I opened the thick envelope beneath the recorder. Inside were printed photographs, bank transfers, phone logs, and one page highlighted in yellow. "Projected sale estimate after Judith relocation." I stared at the sentence numbly. Not after Judith agrees. Not after Judith moves willingly. After Judith relocation. Cold, clinical, like removing an obstacle. Frank's breathing sounded rougher now. "I don't think Cole understands how far Mallory's willing to go," he whispered. "That's the tragedy in all this." Tears finally slipped down my face then. Because even now, after uncovering everything, Frank was still trying to protect our son. still hoping weakness. No, not cruelty, explained his behavior. But I wasn't so sure anymore. The recording crackled softly. If they pressure you after I'm gone, don't leave that house, Frank continued firmly. Promise me, Judy girl. His voice sharpened for the first time. That old protective tone he used whenever life threatened our family. That house belongs to you, legally and morally. I made sure of it. I pressed my lips together tightly. Outside the viewing room, distant muffled sounds drifted through the bank vault hallway. Footsteps. Phones ringing upstairs. Normal life continuing, while mine transformed into something almost unrecognizable. There's one more thing, Frank whispered. A long silence followed. Then, if anything about my death starts feeling wrong, trust your instincts. My entire body went still. Wrong. The word echoed through me like ice water. Frank had died from heart complications. That's what the doctors said. That's what everyone believed. So why would he say that? My pulse began beating harder now. Not grief, not sadness. Fear, real fear. The recording ended with another rough cough and a final quiet sentence. I'm sorry I'm leaving you alone with this. Then silence. I sat motionless in the small vault room for what felt like forever. The recorder rested heavily in my lap, while rainwater tapped faintly somewhere, above the bank ceiling. My husband had spent the final months of his life preparing for betrayal inside his own family. And somehow, he'd been right. I looked back down at the evidence spread across the table. Mallory's emails, property projections, photos, financial notes, every piece fitting together carefully now. Not emotional decisions, not grief. Planning. And suddenly, one memory surfaced so sharply, it made my stomach twist. 3 nights before Frank died, Mallory had insisted on bringing him herbal tea herself. I remembered, because Frank barely drank any of it. He said it tasted strange. At the time, we laughed about it. Now I wasn't laughing anymore. I replayed Frank's recording 3 times before I finally forced myself to turn it off. Each time, different parts hit harder. The exhaustion in his breathing, the disappointment in his voice whenever he mentioned Cole. And that final warning, if anything about my death starts feeling wrong, trust your instincts. I sat alone in the bank's private viewing room with the recorder in my lap and tried to steady my hands. This was madness. Wasn't it? Frank had heart disease. The doctors explained everything clearly. Years of stress at the factory. High blood pressure, exhaustion. People died from those things every day. And yet, a terrible uneasiness had already started spreading through me. Not because of dramatic ideas. Because of memory. Tiny memories. The kind that seem harmless until suddenly they don't. I looked down at another photograph from the envelope. Mallory standing outside Cedar Ridge Pharmacy 6 weeks earlier, beside a woman I vaguely recognized. Then I found the investigator's note attached behind it. Frequent visits regarding medication discussions. Medication. A cold pressure settled behind my ribs. Frank handled dozens of prescriptions near the end. Heart medication, pain medication, sleep aids. Some nights I was so exhausted I barely remembered which bottles had already been opened. And Mallory always insisted on helping. At least let me organize his evening pills, she'd say gently. Judith, you need rest. At the time I felt grateful. Now I felt sick. I gathered the papers carefully back into the envelope and finally stepped outside the viewing room. Stanley looked up immediately from his desk near the vault hallway. One look at my face and his expression changed. What did Frank leave you? I swallowed hard. Questions. That was the only honest answer. Stanley studied me for a long moment before speaking carefully. Judith, if there's something you need to report? I don't know what I think yet. My voice sounded distant even to myself, because I truly didn't know. Grief can make ordinary things feel sinister, but instincts matter too. especially instincts sharpened by 46 years beside the same man. Frank trusted me to notice things. And suddenly I was noticing everything. The drive home felt longer than usual. Clouds hung low over Cedar Ridge, while wind pushed dead leaves across the empty roads. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the farmhouse windows glowed warm against the dark afternoon sky. For a moment, seeing home lit from the inside almost comforted me. Then I remembered who was inside. Mallory opened the front door before I even reached the porch. "You've been gone for hours," she said. Concern coded every word perfectly. Too perfectly. I stopped for lunch. She glanced toward my empty hands. Alone? A strange question. Small, but strange. Yes. Something unreadable flickered briefly across her face before she stepped aside. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and roasted chicken. Mallory had been busy. Whenever she got nervous, she cleaned. I knew that now, too. Cole sat at the kitchen table scrolling through his phones. But he looked up quickly the second I entered. "You okay, Mom? Mom!" Interesting how easily affection returned when uncertainty entered the room. "I'm tired." True, I felt 100 years old, suddenly. Mallory placed a plate onto the counter. "I made dinner early. You need to eat." Again with the performance. The attentive daughter-in-law. The worried caretaker. But now every kindness carried sharp little edges underneath. I sat slowly at the table while Mallory poured iced tea into glasses. Then I froze. The pitcher. A memory hit me instantly. 3 nights before Frank died, Mallory had brought him iced tea in that exact glass pitcher. I remembered because Frank barely touched it. Said it tasted metallic. At the time, Mallory laughed and blamed the refrigerator filter. Now my pulse started beating harder. "Calm down, Judith. You are grieving. People forget things. People imagine patterns where none exist." But another memory surfaced immediately afterward. The night before Frank's final hospital visit, Mallory insisted on picking up his prescription refill alone. "You stay with him," she told me gently. "I'll handle it." At the time, I appreciated the help. Now I wondered why she seemed so determined to involve herself in every medication schedule. Near the end. "You're quiet," Cole said suddenly. I looked up. Both of them were watching me now, carefully, measuring my mood, my awareness, my silence. "I'm just tired," I repeated softly. Mallory sat across from me and folded her hands. "You know," she said carefully, "maybe this stress is exactly why moving somewhere smaller would help." There it was again. Always circling back to the house. Always pushing. Even now. I studied her face quietly. Beautiful. Composed. Cold underneath. "How long have you wanted this house?" I asked. The room went completely silent. Cole blinked hard. Mallory gave a tiny laugh. "Judith, what kind of question is that?" The kind I should have asked years ago. Her smile faded slightly. Only slightly. Cole leaned forward quickly. "Mom, nobody's trying to take anything from you. Not take." Interesting choice of words. I lowered my eyes to the untouched food on my plate. Then I asked the question that had been growing heavier inside me since hearing Frank's recording. "Why were you discussing property transfers before your father died?" The silence afterward felt enormous. Cole's face went pale instantly, and beside him, for the first time since I'd known her, Mallory Rowan looked genuinely afraid. For one long second, nobody moved. The kitchen felt frozen around us. The clock above the refrigerator ticked softly, while wind rattled the porch screens outside. Somewhere upstairs, an air vent hummed quietly through the old farmhouse walls. Ordinary sounds. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. Cole stared at me like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Mallory recovered first. Of course she did. She leaned back slowly in her chair and gave a small, controlled smile. "Judith," she said carefully, "I think grief is making you suspicious." There it was, the strategy, not denial, redirection. Make the old widow seem emotional, confused, fragile. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Is it? Neither of them answered. Cole rubbed his forehead hard. Mom! Dad was sick for a long time. We were trying to prepare for the future. Prepare. Such a harmless word for something that suddenly felt monstrous. You prepared before he was even buried, I said quietly. Mallory's eyes narrowed almost invisibly. You went through our private paperwork? Interesting. Not. What paperwork? Not. What are you talking about? She already knew exactly what I had seen. The realization settled heavily inside me. I visited Stanley Pierce, I answered. The reaction was immediate. Cole's shoulders stiffened. Mallory looked away for half a second too long. Fear again, tiny, controlled, but real. I see, she said softly. No outrage, no confusion, just calculation. That frightened me more than anger would have. Cole pushed his chair back suddenly and stood up. Mom, this is getting blown out of proportion. I looked at him carefully. My son, the little boy who used to cry whenever injured birds fell from nests in our backyard. Now, standing in my kitchen defending property discussions that started before his father's funeral flowers had even wilted. When exactly were you planning to tell me? I asked. His jaw tightened. We didn't know how. Mallory crossed her arms lightly. We were trying to avoid upsetting you. I almost laughed. Upsetting me. As though secretly preparing to remove a grieving widow from her home counted as compassion. The room grew quiet again. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding since leaving the bank. Did either of you ever change Frank's medication? Both of them froze. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for instinct to notice. Cole frowned immediately. What? Mallory's face remained calm, but her fingers tightened slightly against her sleeve. I watched every tiny movement now. Every breath. Every glance. You heard me, I said softly. Cole looked genuinely shocked. Mom, are you serious right now? No, not shocked. Offended. There's a difference. Mallory spoke before he could continue. Frank was dying, Judith. Cold. Direct. No softness left now. He had heart disease. Multiple specialists confirmed it. I held her gaze. I know that. Then what exactly are you suggesting? The tension beneath her voice had finally surfaced. Good. For years, I'd watch her glide through conversations, untouched, perfectly composed, perfectly polite. Now I finally saw the pressure underneath. I'm suggesting, I answered carefully, that a lot of strange things happened before Frank died. Cole shook his head immediately. This is insane. Maybe it was. God help me. Maybe grief really was twisting my mind. But then another memory surfaced. One I hadn't thought about in weeks. The night Frank collapsed. Mallory arrived at the hospital unusually fast. Too fast. Almost as though she already knew something was wrong. At the time, I was too terrified to question it. Now, every memory seemed to carry shadows underneath. Mallory stood slowly from the table. I think you should rest. Again. Rest. Such a useful word when people want older women quiet. Manageable. Dismissed. I looked up at her calmly. You seem nervous. That landed. Her expression hardened for just a second before smoothing itself again. I'm nervous because you're making dangerous accusations. Dangerous. Interesting word. Not hurtful. Not unfair. Dangerous. Cole walked toward the sink and dragged both hands through his hair. Mom, Dad loved Mallory. I know. He trusted her. I thought about the recorder hidden inside purse upstairs. If you're hearing this, then I was right not to trust them. My chest tightened painfully. Frank had trusted very few people near the end, and apparently for good reason. I'm going upstairs, I said quietly. Neither of them stopped me, but I could feel their eyes following me all the way to the staircase. The moment I reached the bedroom, I locked the door behind me. Then I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, Frank and I shared for nearly 5 decades. The room still smelled faintly like his aftershave. That nearly broke me. Because, beneath all the fear and suspicion and anger, I was still just a woman who missed her husband. I reached into my purse slowly and removed the recorder again. My fingers hovered over the play button. There was still one file I hadn't listened to yet. A second recording Frank labeled. For Judith only. If they start pushing too fast. My pulse began beating harder. Downstairs I heard muffled voices. Cole and Mallory arguing quietly. And, for the first time since Frank's funeral, I realized they were no longer fully in control of this story anymore. I waited until the house went completely quiet before pressing play on the second recording. Outside the bedroom windows, rain had started again, soft at first, then steadier. The kind of cold spring rain Frank used to call thinking weather. I sat curled against the headboard, with the recorder in both hands, while the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room. For a moment, static crackled softly through the speaker. Then Frank's voice returned. Lower this time, more tired. Judy girl, if you're listening to this recording, then they started sooner than I hoped. My throat tightened immediately. Sooner, meaning Frank truly believed there would always be a they, not possibility, expectation. I closed my eyes. I need you to stay calm while I explain this, he continued weakly. And I need you to remember something before anything else. A long pause followed. You are not helpless. The tears came instantly then, because grief does strange things to older women. People stop speaking to you, like you're still fully alive after your husband dies. Suddenly everyone explains things slowly, makes decisions for you, calls you emotional when you ask questions. But Frank still saw me, even at the end. There's a folder hidden beneath the false bottom inside my workshop cabinet, he whispered. You'll need it before this is over. My pulse quickened. Workshop cabinet. The old woodworking shop behind the garage. Frank spent half his retirement there, restoring antique furniture and pretending he wasn't avoiding Mallory's conversations during family dinners. I listened carefully. If Mallory pressures Cole hard enough, he'll fold, Frank continued sadly. He always needed someone stronger than him to make decisions. The disappointment in his voice hurt more than anger ever could. Because Frank wasn't cruel. He was grieving our son while still alive. I failed him somewhere, he whispered. No, I said aloud instinctively into the empty room. But the recorder kept playing. I kept hoping he'd finally see her clearly. Her, not them. Frank believed Mallory drove everything. And deep down, I was beginning to believe it too. The recording crackled again. 3 weeks ago, I overheard Mallory talking on the phone outside the workshop. My breathings slowed. She thought I was asleep. Rain tapped harder against the windows now, while my entire body turned cold beneath the blanket. She said, once the old man is gone, the house won't be difficult. Judith's too emotional to fight back. I covered my mouth instantly. The cruelty of hearing my husband repeat those words nearly destroyed me. Not because Mallory wanted the house, because she discussed us like obstacles, objects, problems to remove. Frank coughed heavily for several seconds before continuing. I wanted to confront Cole immediately, he admitted, but I needed proof first. Proof. That, explained the investigator. The documents. The recordings. Frank had been quietly building protection around me while dying, and I never knew. Guilt twisted painfully through my chest. How many nights had he lain awake beside me carrying this fear alone? I changed the ownership structure after that phone call, he said softly. I froze. Ownership structure. My mind immediately returned to Stanley's office. The papers. The legal protections. Everything belongs to you completely, Judith. Frank had acted fast, quietly, without telling anyone. Maybe without even telling Cole because he still hoped his son would come to his senses before things became ugly. Another pause followed. Then Frank's voice lowered further. There's something else you need to know. The room felt suddenly airless. The night before my final hospital visit, Mallory came into my workshop. Every muscle in my body tightened. She asked where I kept the updated property documents. His breathing sounded strained now. When I told her that information wasn't her concern, she smiled. A cold shiver moved down my spine. I knew that smile. Polite, controlled, dangerous underneath. She said, "Families should plan ahead, Frank, especially when people become vulnerable." That word again. People like Mallory loved words that reduced others into weakness. Old, fragile, emotional, vulnerable. The recording crackled softly. "Judy girl, if they're already trying to push you out, then don't trust appearances anymore." I stared toward the bedroom door automatically. Downstairs, silence filled the farmhouse. But suddenly, silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. "I'm sorry," Frank whispered again. "I should have protected you sooner." My chest ached so badly I could barely breathe, because even now, after uncovering everything, my first instinct wasn't anger. It was heartbreak. Frank spent his final weeks afraid for me. Afraid inside his own home. The recording continued. In the workshop cabinet, you'll also find copies of conversations the investigator recorded. My heartbeat stopped. Recorded conversations. Real evidence. Not suspicions. Not instincts. Evidence. "If anything happens to me faster than expected," Frank whispered carefully, "give those recordings to Stanley Pierce. Faster than expected." There it was again. That same phrase. Not if I die. If something happens. Fear spread slowly through my stomach. Because suddenly I realized something horrifying. Frank truly believed his death might not be entirely natural. The recording ended quietly after that. Just breathing. Then silence. I sat motionless in the dark bedroom while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the yacht fields surrounding our farmhouse. My husband had left me a map. A trail. Proof, hidden piece by piece because he no longer trusted the people living under our roof. Downstairs, I suddenly heard footsteps moving softly across the kitchen floor. Then voices, low, urgent, Cole and Mallory, arguing again. And this time, I heard my own name. I turned off the bedside lamp immediately. The bedroom fell into darkness except for brief flashes of lightning beyond the windows. Downstairs, the voices continued. Muffled, sharp, tense. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the bed, barely breathing. Then I heard it clearly. "She knows something, Mallory." Her voice carried none of its usual sweetness now. Only irritation. Fear. Cole answered too quietly for me to catch every word, but I heard enough. Maybe Stanley told her. Stanley. My stomach tightened. So they had been worried about him all along. I slipped silently off the bed and moved toward the hallway door, careful to avoid the loose floorboard near Frank's dresser. After 46 years in this house, I knew every sound. Another flash of lightning lit the upstairs hallway pale blue. The farmhouse creaked softly around me. Below, Mallory's voice rose again. "You should have handled this weeks ago." Handled this. Not discussed. Not resolved. Handled. Cole sounded exhausted now. I wasn't going to throw my mother out right after Dad died. At this point, she's going to fight us anyway. Fight us. I closed my eyes briefly. Not once had either of them discussed what was fair, only what was convenient. Another silence followed downstairs. Then Cole asked the question that made my blood turn cold. What if she found the recordings? My hand tightened instantly around the recorder hidden beneath my sweater. Recordings, plural. So they knew recordings existed, which meant Frank had hidden more evidence than even I realized. Mallory lowered her voice after that, but years of motherhood sharpened hearing in strange ways. "She couldn't have," she whispered. Unless Stanley gave her access already. Access. The word settled heavily inside me. They weren't nervous about hurting me anymore. They were nervous about exposure. I stepped backward quietly from the bedroom door and forced myself to think clearly. Panic wouldn't help Frank now, and it wouldn't protect me. I returned to the bed slowly and sat down just as footsteps approached the staircase. Then came silence. A few seconds later, someone knocked softly at my bedroom door. 3 light taps. Mallory. "Judith?" she called gently. "Are you awake?" I stared at the door without answering. Another knock. "We're worried about you." "No, you're worried about yourselves," I thought. "I'm tired," I answered finally. A pause followed. Then Mallory spoke again, carefully measured. "Cole thinks maybe we should all sit down tomorrow and clear up misunderstandings." Misunderstandings. Interesting word for secret property plans and hidden recordings. "I'm going to sleep," I said quietly. Another long silence. Then footsteps retreating down the hallway. I waited until I heard their bedroom door close before moving again. My heart pounded painfully now. Not from fear alone, from clarity. Frank had been right. Everything was escalating faster than expected. I crossed the bedroom quickly and knelt beside Frank's old cedar chest near the window seat. Inside, beneath folded blankets and old photo albums, I hid the recorder and documents from the bank inside a zippered sewing bag no one else would ever touch voluntarily. Mallory hated sewing. Good. Once everything was hidden, I sat back against the bed and tried to slow my breathing. The farmhouse suddenly felt unfamiliar, not because the walls changed, because trust had disappeared from inside them. I looked toward Frank's empty side of the bed. For the first time since his funeral, anger finally rose stronger than grief. Not loud anger, not screaming, something colder. They had months planning my removal while I cared for Frank through the final stage of his life. While I changed his sheets, held his hand through chest pain. Stayed awake listening to his breathing at night, because I feared every silence. And downstairs, during those same weeks, my son and his wife were discussing property transfers. I wiped my face quickly. No more crying tonight. Frank didn't leave those recordings so I could collapse. He left them because he knew I would eventually need strength. Around midnight, I finally heard the house settle into silence. No footsteps, no voices, only rain tapping softly against the porch roof. I stood slowly and walked toward the bedroom window. Beyond the glass, I could see the outline of Frank's workshop behind the garage. Dark, quiet, waiting. The hidden folder. The investigator's recordings. More proof. Frank had practically been begging me to find it. And suddenly, I understood why he kept emphasizing one thing over and over. Do not trust appearances. Because upstairs, Cole still looked like my son. Mallory still's like family. And yet underneath those appearances lived something ruthless enough to plan around a dying man. I glanced toward the digital clock beside the bed. 12:47 a.m., too late tonight. But tomorrow morning, before either of them woke up, I was going into Frank's workshop. Then, just as I turned away from the window, headlights swept briefly across the bedroom ceiling. A car, pulling slowly into our driveway. At nearly 1 in the morning, my pulse instantly quickened. I moved carefully toward the curtain and peeked outside. A dark sedan sat near the mailbox. The driver remained inside for several seconds. Then the interior light flickered on, and my entire body went cold when I recognized the man's stepping out of the car. It was the private investigator Frank had hired. I froze beside the bedroom window, one hand still gripping the curtain. Rain dripped steadily from the porch roof, while the dark sedan idled near the mailbox. The man stepping out wore a tan jacket and carried a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. I recognized him immediately from the photographs inside Frank's lockbox. The investigator, tall, gray-haired, quiet eyes. For one irrational second, panic rushed through me. Had Mallory called him? Had something happened? Then the man looked directly toward the upstairs window and gave one small nod. Not threatening, careful, deliberate. My pulse hammered painfully as I backed away from the curtain. Downstairs, I suddenly heard movement. Cole's bedroom door opening. Damn. I moved quickly toward the hallway and listened. Footsteps descended the stairs. Then Mallory's sleepy voice floated faintly upward. "Who is it?" "I don't know," Cole muttered. The investigator knocked 3 times. Slow. Measured. The sound echoed through the quiet farmhouse. I stayed hidden at the top of the staircase while Cole opened the front door halfway. Rain blew lightly across the porch between them. "Can I help you?" Cole asked cautiously. The investigator removed his cap. "My name is Raymond Vance," he said calmly. "I worked for your father." Worked. Past tense. Something about those words tightened the air instantly. Cole stiffened. "It's after midnight." "I know." Raymond glanced briefly toward the staircase. "But I need to speak with Judith Rowan immediately." Behind Cole, Mallory appeared wearing a pale robe tied tightly at the waist. Even half awake, her expression sharpened. The second she heard the investigator's name, that reaction told me everything. She knew exactly who he was. "I think this conversation can wait until morning," she said smoothly. Raymond looked directly at her. "No," he answered flatly. "It can't." The silence afterward felt dangerous. Mallory recovered quickly. "Judith's exhausted. She's grieving. Again. Grieving. Their favorite word whenever they wanted me dismissed." I stepped forward before she could continue. "I'm awake." All 3 of them looked up instantly. Cole's face tightened with surprise. Sight. Mallory's expression changed too slowly. Fear, real fear this time. I descended the staircase carefully, while Raymond watched me with steady eyes. "Mrs. Rowan," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for the hour." "That's all right." My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Raymond glanced briefly toward Cole and Mallory before speaking again. "I tried contacting Stanley Pierce earlier tonight. He said you already opened the lockbox." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Mallory folded her arms tightly across her chest. Cole looked pale. Raymond continued carefully. "Frank instructed me to come immediately if that happened." Frank instructed. Even now, from beyond the grave, my husband was still moving pieces into place. I reached the bottom stair slowly. "What is this about?" Raymond hesitated. Then he looked directly at Mallory. "That depends," he said quietly, "on whether this conversation is private." The tension in the room became unbearable instantly. Cole stepped forward defensively. "Whatever this is, you can say it in front of us." Raymond didn't even look at him. "No," he answered calmly. "I can't." Mallory's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous, maybe. But suddenly I trusted Raymond Vance more than the people standing inside my own home." I looked at Cole quietly. "Go upstairs." Shock crossed his face. "Mom, now." For the first time in years, my voice carried the same authority it once had when Cole was a child. And for one brief moment, he obeyed automatically. Mallory didn't move. "Judith," she said carefully, "you have no idea what this man might tell you." Raymond finally turned toward her fully. "Oh," he said softly, "I think she does." That landed harder than shouting. Mallory's face drained of color. I had never seen her lose composure before. Not once, until now. "Upstairs," I repeated quietly. This time, Cole touched Mallory's arm gently. "We should go." She stared at Raymond several long seconds before finally turning away. But as she passed me on the staircase, she stopped just long enough to whisper, "Be careful who you trust." The irony almost made me laugh. Once they disappeared upstairs, Raymond waited until he heard their bedroom door close before speaking again. Then he handed me the leather folder. Inside were photographs, bank statements, audio transcripts, and one final page clipped separately at the front. Toxicology concerns. Unofficial observations only. My blood turned to ice. I looked up slowly. What is this? Raymond exhaled heavily. 3 weeks before Frank died, he asked me to investigate whether someone had been tampering with his medication. The room tilted beneath me. I gripped the edge of the staircase, railing hard enough to hurt my hand. No? Raymond's eyes softened slightly. We never proved it conclusively, he said carefully. But Frank became increasingly convinced something was wrong. My chest tightened so painfully I could barely breathe. The herbal tea, the medication refills. Mallory's insisting on organizing pills. Every memory returned sharper now. Raymond lowered his voice. There's more. He removed a small digital flash drive from his pocket. 2 days before Frank died, he said quietly, I recorded a conversation between Mallory Rowan and a man connected to her failed real estate investment. I stared at the flash drive in horror. And Judith? Raymond said carefully. Your son was there too. I couldn't feel my hands anymore. The flash drive rested in my palm like something alive while rain battered softly against the farmhouse windows behind us. Cole was there too. Those 4 words echoed through me, louder than thunder. For one desperate second, I wanted Raymond to take it back. Tell me he misunderstood. Tell my son stood up for his father. Tell me there was still something left to save. But Raymond Vance didn't look like a man carrying misunderstandings. He looked tired, the kind of tired people carry after watching a family destroy itself quietly. I lowered myself slowly into the chair beside the staircase because my knees suddenly felt weak. Raymond sat across from me at the dining room table. Frank built with his own hands 30 years earlier. The same table where Mallory told me to pack my bags. The same table where my son stayed silent. Funny how quickly a home can become a crime scene for the heart. What's on it? I whispered. Raymond hesitated carefully. A conversation about the property, he answered. About Frank's condition. About timing. Timing, my stomach twisted violently. Not grief. Not concern. Timing. Raymond removed an old laptop from his bag and inserted the flash drive quietly. Static crackled softly through the speakers, then voices. Mallory's came first, sharp, cold, impatient. If the house stays tied up after he dies, we lose the Benton investment completely. A man answered her, someone older. I recognized his voice vaguely from town council events. Gerald Pike, a real estate developer. Then came Cole. My son sounded exhausted, uneasy. This feels wrong, he muttered. For one terrible second, hope flickered inside me. Then Mallory laughed softly. Wrong? She said. Cole, your father's dying either way. The room around me disappeared. I stopped breathing, stopped thinking. All I could hear was her voice, calm, practical, cruel. She'll never leave willingly after Frank's gone, Mallory continued. So we need everything positioned beforehand. Everything positioned, like pieces on a chessboard. Like my marriage, my home, my life. Cole spoke again, quieter this time. What if Mom finds out, Mom? Not Judith. Not the widow. For one brief second, he sounded like my son again. Then Mallory answered. She won't. She trusts us. I closed my eyes. That sentence hurt more than anything else. Because she was right. I did trust them. I trusted family. I trusted the boy I raised. I trusted the woman I welcomed into my home for 15 years. And they used that trust like a weapon. The recording continued for several more minutes. Property discussions, insurance timelines, financial pressure, nothing directly proving murder, but enough ugliness to poison every memory I had left. When the audio finally ended, silence encircled the farmhouse. Raymond removed the flash drive quietly. I'm sorry, he said softly. I nodded once because words no longer felt possible. Upstairs, floorboards creaked faintly. Cole and Mallory were awake. Probably listening. Probably terrified. Good. For days, I had lived inside fear while they controlled the narrative. Not anymore. I stood slowly. Every part of me felt older than 71 years. But strangely, dear. What happens now? Raymond asked carefully. Frank's photographs still lined the mantel. His reading glasses still rested beside the newspaper basket. His jacket still hung near the back door, where he left it after his final walk outside. This house was full of him. Not them. Him. They leave, I said quietly. Raymond studied my face for a moment. Then he nodded. No dramatic speeches. No revenge fantasies. Just truth. At 6:14 the next morning, I made breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. Exactly the way Frank liked it. The sunrise spilled pale gold through the kitchen curtains, while Cole and Mallory entered cautiously, both looking exhausted. Neither spoke at first. I placed coffee cups onto the table calmly. Then I sat down across from them. Mallory tried first. Judith. No. My voice stopped her instantly. Not loud. Just finished. I folded my hands together carefully. I know about the recordings. Cole went white. Mallory didn't even try to fake confusion anymore. Interesting how quickly masks fall apart once truth enters the room. I know about the property plans, I continued quietly. I know about Gerald Pike. I know you discussed my future before Frank was even buried. Cole stared down at the table. Mallory remained silent. Good. Let silence finally do its job. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall yet. You didn't just betray me, I whispered. You betrayed him. That landed hardest on Cole. His face collapsed instantly. Because deep down, my son knew exactly what he had become. I never wanted to hurt you, he said weakly. But weak men cause damage every day. Frank was right about that too. I reached into my pocket and placed the house documents carefully onto the table. The farmhouse belongs entirely to me, I said. Legally, permanently. Mallory's expression cracked completely then. Real panic. Finally. You can't seriously. I can. My voice stayed calm. That frightened them more than anger would have. You'll both be gone by Friday. Cole looked shattered. Mallory looked furious. And me? I just felt tired. Tired enough to finally stop protecting people who would never protect me back. Neither of them argued much after that. Maybe because evidence changes people. Maybe because guilt does too. By noon, Mallory was upstairs packing. By sunset, Cole stood awkwardly beside his truck in the driveway, unable to meet my eyes. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered. I believed he meant it. Love without courage becomes useless, eventually. I looked past him toward the hills beyond Cedar Ridge, where storm clouds were, finally breaking apart. Then I answered honestly. So am I. After they left, the farmhouse became quiet again. But not hollow, not anymore. That night, I sat alone on the back porch, wrapped in Frank's old wool blanket, while summer crickets hummed across the fields. For the first time since the funeral, I could finally grieve my husband, without also grieving the illusion of my family. And somehow, beneath all the heartbreak, I felt him there beside me, steady, protective, still loving me after all these years, just like he promised. Losing Frank taught me something painful about family. Love alone does not protect you from betrayal. Sometimes the people sitting closest to your table are already planning your removal while you're still serving them dinner. But I also learned this. Growing older does not make a woman weak, invisible, or easy to erase. And in the end, the greatest gift Frank left me wasn't the house or the documents. It was the reminder to finally trust my own instincts.